Before the money, before the headlines, before anyone even understood what was happening, Shedeur Sanders made a decision that quietly flipped the entire power dynamic. He didn't walk into brand meetings asking how big the check was. He walked in asking who actually owned the outcome. And when the answer wasn't good enough, he walked away. Not because the money was small, but because the structure was wrong. That choice is why this story isn't really about a deal or a fashion show or even football. It's about what happens when someone realizes they don't need permission to rewrite the rules. While most athletes are taught to chase exposure and hope it turns into leverage later, Shedeur did the opposite. He treated leverage like the starting point. The shocking part isn't that brands agreed, it's that they adjusted. Because once you understand what he rejected, you start to see what he was actually building. This wasn't a flex, it wasn't a gamble, it was a message to an industry that's been operating on autopilot for decades. Don't put my face on your product unless I'm part of the engine behind it. Don't talk partnerships unless that word actually means shared power. And here's where it gets interesting. What followed didn't just benefit him, it exposed how fragile the old system really was. One announcement triggered demand that infrastructure couldn't handle. One contract forced entire departments to rethink how value is distributed. And one athlete proved that cultural power isn't given to you after the fact, it's designed from the start. The moment you see how this unfolded, you realize this was never about a bag, it was about control. The foundation was laid long before the public noticed anything unusual. Shedeur Sanders drew a line early, and it wasn't subtle. No ownership, no deal. That wasn't a quote crafted for headlines or a negotiator's bluff. It was a fixed rule. If his presence was going to generate value, then his participation had to reflect that value structurally, not symbolically. That mindset immediately separated him from the traditional athlete playbook. Most players are conditioned to see endorsement offers as validation. Big brand calls, big money, sign fast before the moment passes. Shedeur did the opposite. When presented with a massive offer, reports claim he didn't hesitate to turn it down because equity wasn't on the table. That decision confused people inside the industry, not because it was reckless, but because it challenged assumptions they'd never had to defend before. This wasn't about ego or trying to sound revolutionary, it was about leverage awareness. Shedeur understood something many athletes are taught too late. Attention is an asset, and assets should compound. Exposure disappears, ownership accumulates. By refusing to move forward without a stake in the outcome, he reframed the conversation from endorsement to partnership. Suddenly, brands weren't negotiating access to his image, they were negotiating alignment with his ecosystem. What made this shift so disruptive is how early it happened. This wasn't a late career power play or a victory lap deal. It came when most athletes are told to be grateful, stay quiet, and build a resume. Instead, Shedeur forced companies to decide whether they wanted short-term visibility or long-term participation, and some of them blinked. That moment changed everything, because once a brand concedes ownership to an athlete, the old hierarchy starts to crack. The athlete isn't talent anymore, he's infrastructure. And once that line was drawn, there was no going back. The question was no longer whether this approach would work, it was how far it would go.
For decades, the endorsement model has been painfully simple. A brand pays an athlete to wear the product, say a line, post a photo, and move on. The athlete gets a check. The company keeps the upside. That structure has survived not because it's fair, but because it's familiar. Shedeur Sanders didn't just question that setup, he treated it like outdated software. Instead of accepting flat fees tied to appearances or campaigns, he pushed for participation in the upside. Not bonuses, not performance clauses, actual ownership logic, royalties that scale, equity that appreciates, deals where his success directly translated into shared gains, not just brand impressions. This wasn't branding bravado, it was business math. If his name drives demand, then his name should live on the balance sheet. That approach quietly dismantled the default assumptions brands rely on. Normally, companies view athletes as interchangeable megaphones. One face ages out, another gets signed. But Shedeur forced a rethink by framing his likeness as intellectual property. His audience wasn't rented attention, it was a distribution channel he already controlled. That flipped the leverage entirely. Brands weren't buying exposure anymore, they were negotiating access. What made this especially jarring was how clean and unemotional the strategy was. No public ultimatums, no dramatic walkouts, just a calm refusal to move forward under legacy terms. Reports suggest this forced multiple brands to revisit how they structure athlete deals, not just for him, but internally. Once you grant profit participation to one athlete, it becomes hard to justify denying it to the next. This is where the old endorsement model starts to collapse, because flat fees cap potential, but royalties compound. Ownership grows while campaigns fade. Shedeur's deals weren't about chasing the biggest upfront number, they were about building systems where value flows back to the source that created it. And once that logic is introduced into an industry built on one-sided upside, the math stops working the old way. That's when the rewrite truly begins. The real shock didn't come from an announcement or a press release. It came from where Shedeur Sanders was positioned when the spotlight finally hit. This wasn't a cameo. It wasn't a front-row appearance or a celebrity walk meant to spark a few headlines. When Amiri aligned with him, the message was clear from the start. This wasn't decoration, it was authorship. Luxury fashion has a long history of borrowing athletic influence without ever surrendering control. Athletes show up, generate buzz, then disappear while the house keeps the prestige and the profit. This time, the structure was different. Shedeur wasn't slotted in as an accessory to someone else's vision. He was elevated as a co-headliner, standing beside his brother not as a symbol, but as a central voice shaping the moments. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because the difference between appearing and co-leading is power. Appearing says you're allowed in the room. Co-leading says you help decide what the room looks like. Reports from inside the industry suggest that this wasn't a last-minute experiment or a PR gamble. It was calculated, data-backed, a recognition that Shedeur didn't just bring attention, he brought an activated audience that moves when he moves. What followed proved that assumption correct. Within hours of the announcement, demand spiked so aggressively that systems buckled. Not from manufactured hype, not from paid traffic, from real people responding in real time. The reaction exposed something fashion brands rarely admit out loud. Cultural pull now matters more than legacy positioning. And when cultural pull is owned by the individual, not the institution, the balance of power shifts instantly. This wasn't fashion flirting with sports. It was fashion acknowledging a new center of gravity. Amiri didn't just feature an athlete, they aligned with a blueprint. And in doing so, they signaled something bigger than a successful collaboration. They confirmed that the old separation between athlete and creator, influence and control, no longer holds. That moment wasn't an anomaly, it was the first visible crack in a wall that had been standing for decades. What happened next is where the story stops being symbolic and starts being measurable. Systems don't fail because of vibes, they fail under load. And when demand surged, it exposed how unprepared legacy infrastructure is for audiences that don't just watch, but act. This wasn't casual browsing traffic or delayed interest trickling in over days. It was immediate, concentrated, and forceful enough to overwhelm platforms designed for normal celebrity engagement. That distinction is critical. Modern luxury brands spend millions stress testing their systems. High-profile drops, global campaigns, coordinated rollouts, all of it is engineered to handle scale. So when infrastructure buckles anyway, it signals something deeper than popularity. It means the underlying assumptions were wrong. They planned for attention, they didn't plan for activation. What unfolded wasn't chaos, it was clarity. Real demand doesn't wait, it doesn't trickle, it floods. And when it does, it reveals which systems were built for optics and which were built for participation. This wasn't a case of people liking, sharing, or commenting. People showed up ready to transact. That's the difference between an audience that observes and one that engages economically. And that's why this moment mattered beyond headlines. It proved that the old funnel model, awareness first, conversion later, doesn't hold when an individual owns direct trust with their audience. There was no warm-up period, no long runway. The switch flipped and demand followed instantly. That's not brand magic, that's alignment between influence and ownership. What made it even more disruptive is that no traditional gatekeeper orchestrated it. No legacy media rollout, no multi-week hype cycle, just alignment, announcement, response. That sequence unnerved people behind the scenes because it suggested something uncomfortable. Control has shifted. When individuals command trust at scale, institutions can't pace or manage the outcome the way they used to. The failure wasn't embarrassing, it was instructive. It showed that the old systems were never built to support creators who function as economic engines. They were built to manage talent, not partners. And once that distinction becomes obvious, the conversation changes. Because you can't fix a system problem with better marketing, you have to redesign the structure itself. If you zoom out far enough, the pattern becomes obvious. None of these moves exist in isolation. Nothing is random, impulsive, or trend-chasing. Shedeur Sanders isn't stacking deals for headlines. He's assembling an ecosystem where every piece feeds the next. Each vertical solves a different problem, reaches a different audience, and reinforces the same core asset: trust. Start with the food play. On the surface, it feels almost too ordinary, even playful, but that's exactly the point. Food isn't aspirational in the way luxury fashion is. It's personal. It lives inside homes, families, routines. By placing his name in something as communal as sauce, he anchors his identity in everyday culture, not just highlights and contracts. It makes him accessible without making him small, relatable without diluting power. That grounding is strategic. Then there's gaming, which serves an entirely different function. Gaming isn't about nostalgia or comfort, it's about identity formation. Younger audiences don't build loyalty through press conferences or sports debate shows. They build it through interaction. By embedding himself in that world, he doesn't ask for attention, he becomes part of how people spend their time. That presence compounds because it reaches generations that aren't waiting to be marketed to. They're choosing where to engage. The wellness space completes the triangle. That move isn't about hype or visibility, it's about credibility and time horizons. Wellness signals longevity. It ties his brand to performance, sustainability, and life beyond weekly results. That framing quietly removes his value from short-term outcomes and locks it into systems that outlive seasons and narratives. It says this isn't a moment, it's a framework designed to endure. What makes this ecosystem powerful isn't any single deal, it's the way each one protects the others. Fashion builds prestige, food builds intimacy, gaming builds reach, wellness builds trust. When one rises, they all benefit. Jersey sales spike, cultural relevance expands. Cultural relevance expands, brand equity increases. This isn't diversification for safety, it's integration for momentum. And here's the key detail most people miss. He doesn't rely on any one gatekeeper to keep the system alive. If one sector cools, the others sustain it. That's not accidental, that's architecture. This is what happens when someone stops thinking in campaigns and starts thinking in networks. Every move is a node. Every node reinforces the whole. And once you see the ecosystem clearly, you realize the real play was never about deals at all. It was about designing something that can't collapse from a single point of failure. What makes all of this even more disruptive is how little noise surrounds it. In an era where attention is currency and outrage is often treated like marketing fuel, Shedeur Sanders chose a different weapon: silence. Not avoidance, not hesitation, deliberate restraint. While critics tried to pull him into debates, frame his confidence as distraction, or code their skepticism in familiar ways, he refused to take the bait. That restraint isn't passive, it's controlling. Every time he declines to clap back, he denies others the chance to define the narrative. No viral arguments, no emotional sound bites, no interview clips designed to be dissected out of context. Instead, he lets numbers speak. Contracts, sales, ownership clauses, demand. Those are harder to argue with and impossible to spin away. This approach quietly disarms an entire media playbook. Sports culture thrives on reaction. A hot take needs a response. A critique needs friction. When none comes, the conversation collapses under its own weight. That's what makes silence so effective here. It forces attention away from perception and onto outcomes. You can debate personality. You can't debate infrastructure failing under real demand. There's also a discipline required to hold that line. Staying quiet while others speculate, misread, or underestimate takes confidence rooted in structure. This only works if you know the system you've built can withstand scrutiny. Otherwise, silence looks like weakness. In this case, it reads as certainty. He's not waiting for validation because he already has leverage. And that's what unnerves people the most. When an athlete doesn't need controversy to stay relevant, it exposes how much of the industry depends on noise. Every move he makes redirects attention back to execution, back to receipts, back to the reality that value doesn't have to be explained when it's already visible. That refusal to engage on everyone else's terms is a power move in itself. It signals that the game isn't being played at the same level anymore. While others argue about narratives, he's negotiating
structure. And once the results are locked in, the commentary stops mattering, because silence backed by execution is louder than any response. The shift didn't register all at once. It happened quietly, behind closed doors, in conference rooms where contracts started to feel outdated the moment they were opened. Front offices, agencies, and brand executives began revisiting assumptions they hadn't questioned in years. Because once Shedeur Sanders proved this model could work, the uncomfortable truth surfaced. The old framework wasn't just unfair, it was inefficient. For teams and organizations used to evaluating athletes strictly through on-field production, this forced a recalibration. Reports suggest some decision-makers underestimated how much off-field structure now feeds back into performance, leverage, and long-term value. The mistake wasn't about talent, it was about vision. In a league still adjusting to players as full-spectrum operators, the idea that an athlete could function as a self-contained economic engine caught people flat-footed. Brands felt it even faster. Once ownership and royalty logic enters a negotiation successfully, it doesn't leave. Executives may not say it publicly, but internally the questions change. Why are we still offering flat fees? How do we justify controlling upside when the audience lives with the athlete, not the logo? One precedent becomes leverage for the next athlete walking through the door, and suddenly what looked like an exception starts to feel like a warning. Agents and advisors had to adjust too. The traditional pitch deck, exposure, prestige, alignment, started sounding thin compared to equity, participation, and governance. Younger players began asking sharper questions, not how much, but how is this structured? That's a seismic change. Once athletes realize they can negotiate not just presence, but power, the entire talent economy tightens. What makes this a wake-up call instead of a trend is that it didn't rely on controversy or a once-in-a-generation moment. It relied on execution, numbers, systems responding or failing in real time. There was no narrative spin needed. The impact showed up in contracts being rewritten and internal playbooks quietly updated. And here's the part that rattled the industry most. This wasn't a superstar bending the system after decades of dominance. This was someone operating early, decisively, and without asking permission. That timeline compresses everyone else's margin for error, because if this approach works now, it will be standard soon. And anyone still clinging to the old rules isn't just behind, they're already obsolete. When you step back and look at the full picture, it becomes clear this was never about one deal, one brand, or one moment. It was about a structural reset. What Shedeur Sanders exposed is something the industry has tried to delay for years. The balance of power has already moved, and the old systems just haven't caught up yet. The real shift isn't cultural visibility. Athletes have had that. It isn't influence either. Social media solved that years ago. The shift is ownership, control, governance, the ability to decide how value circulates once attention is generated. That's the leap most institutions hoped would come slowly, in isolated cases, easy to contain. This moment proved the opposite. Once someone shows the blueprint works, the door doesn't close again. This is why the conversation moving forward will sound different. Athletes won't ask for better branding opportunities, they'll ask for equity. They won't settle for being faces of campaigns. They'll expect to help design the framework behind them. And brands that still think exposure is enough will struggle to explain why the upside flows only one way. What makes this shift irreversible is that it's already measurable. Demand materialized instantly. Systems failed publicly. Contracts changed quietly. You can't argue with that, and you can't roll it back without losing relevance to a generation that understands value isn't about being seen, it's about being positioned correctly. This isn't about rebellion or disruption for attention. It's about replacing outdated logic with something that actually reflects how culture moves now. Power no longer trickles down from institutions, it builds outward from individuals who own their audience and know how to activate it. And that's the lasting takeaway. This wasn't a celebrity moment or a fashion headline. It was the visible proof of an invisible shift already underway. The era of passive athlete marketing is ending. What's replacing it is something far more permanent, a system where those who generate value help decide where it goes. And now that the framework exists, the rest of the industry doesn't get to ask if it's coming. They only get to decide whether they adapt in time.